Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hi everyone, how are you today? Good? Yes. Right, I'm also good, thank you. Right, so today we are going to continue our discussion on the clauses. Remember, last time we already discussed about two different types of clauses. Those are independent clause and dependent clause. And today we are going to focus on dependent clause. There are four outlines that we are going to discuss today. First, the definitions of dependent clause. Then the second, the characteristic of dependent clause. And then the third, the types of dependent clause. And finally, the examples of dependent clause. Are you curious about those two things? Those four things, I mean? Yes, all right. So let's talk about them one by one. First, what is the definitions of dependent clauses? So a dependent clause is a grammatical unit that contains a subject and a verb, but cannot stand alone as a complete thought. Why can it stand alone? Because it is always preceded by connector. So remember, all of the clauses that is started with a connector can never stand alone by itself. It can never have the complete thought. So that's why we call that as dependent clause, and then we have to connect this dependent clause into independent clause so that we can create a complex sentence. And then what are the characteristics of dependent clause? So let's see. First, it should have subject, of course. And then the second, it should also have verb or predicate. And the last one is, this is important thing, it should have connector. Remember, all dependent clause must be started with connector. Whatever type of its dependent clause, it must have started with the connector. And after the connector, there comes subject and also verb or predicate. And because it is always connected, or because it is always started with the connector, then dependent clause can never have the complete thought. So that is the characteristic of dependent clause. And then, what are the types of dependent clause? So there are three types of dependent clause. The first one is adverb clause. The other one is adjective clause. And the last one is the noun clause. And each of these different types of dependent clause will be characterized by its connector. We are going to talk later about these connector that are suitable for these types of dependent clause. So there will be connector that only suits for adverb clause, and there are also connector that only suits for adjective clause, and there are also connector that are only suitable for noun clause. So those are the types of the dependent clause. And what about the example? Let me give you the example of those dependent clauses. The first one is the adverb clause. The example is, although it was raining, and after this dependent clause, although it was raining, you need comma before you attach it to independent clause. The word although is functioning as the connector. And then the second example is, when I finish my work. When I finish my work, if you pay attention, consists of connector, when. It also consists of subject, I, and it also consists of verb, finish. The book that he recommend, if you see this example, the book that he recommend here function as the dependent clause, specifically adjective clause, because that he recommend explain or describe about the book in this case. If we see that he recommend also consists of connector, subject, and also verb. So remember, those are the example of dependent clauses. And because it can never be a complete thought, to make it a correct sentence, we have to attach it into independent clause. So that's all about the dependent clause. What can we conclude from our discussion today? We know that dependent clause has never been a complete thought. Why? Because it is always started with the connector. And then we also know that after the connector, that comes subject and also verb. So that's all about the dependent clause today. I'll see you again in the next discussion, specifically talking about the types of dependent clause. Thank you very much for your attention, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.